There are 11 abandoned towns scattered across the Pacific Northwest where something went terribly wrong. Not slow economic decline, not natural disaster, something else. In Govan, photographers hear children's voices responding to their names. In Molson, time doesn't move forward anymore. In Monte Cristo, the mountains keep what enters them. These towns didn't just die. They transformed into something that waits in the silence between the trees and the fog. Tonight, we're visiting all 11. Some of you won't make it to the end. I'm Verified Fears, and these are the nightmares the Pacific Northwest tried to bury. You've driven 3 hours through the wheat fields of Lincoln County to photograph a building that's been dead for over 80 years. The Govan schoolhouse sits alone off Highway 2, its weathered boards the color of old bones, windows like hollow eye sockets staring across empty land. You've seen the photos online. Every urban explorer and photographer has made the pilgrimage here. But you want the shot they haven't captured yet. The one that shows what it feels like to stand in a place where childhood ended and never quite left. The afternoon sun hangs low when you arrive, casting long shadows that make the building look like it's reaching toward you. The structure tilts slightly, as if the earth beneath is slowly swallowing it. The red paint has mostly peeled away, leaving raw wood that somehow survived decades of harsh winters. You park on the dirt road and grab your camera gear, noting the absolute silence. No birds, no wind, just the sound of your boots on gravel. The front door hangs open, has been open for years judging by the rust on the hinges. You step inside, and dust motes dance in the amber light, filtering through broken windows. The main classroom is smaller than you expected, maybe 30 feet across, with a teacher's desk still positioned at the front. Desks are scattered throughout, some overturned, others sitting in neat rows as if students just stepped out for recess and never returned. The blackboard stretches across the front wall, and something about it makes your skin prickle. Chalk dust coats everything, far too much for a building that's been abandoned since 1942. You raise your camera and start shooting. The composition is perfect. Light streaming through the windows, illuminating the decay in golden tones. You move through the room, capturing angles, textures, the way time has transformed this space into something between museum and mausoleum. That's when you notice the handprints. They're on several desks, small handprints in the thick dust, and they look fresh. Too fresh. You lean closer, examining them. The dust around the prints is undisturbed, as if the hands simply materialized, pressed down, and vanished. You haven't touched any desks yet. You've been careful, walking around them, staying near the walls. Your rational mind offers explanations. Other photographers, local kids exploring. But none of them account for the size of these prints. They're tiny, belonging to children no older than 7 or 8. You photograph them anyway. Documentation over comfort. Through your viewfinder, you notice something else. On the blackboard, barely visible in the fading light, someone has written in chalk, "Attendance." Below it, a list of names in careful cursive. You lower your camera and walk closer, reading them. Mary, William, Thomas, Catherine. 8 names total, the kind of old-fashioned names you'd expect from the 1940s. At the bottom, in fresher chalk, one more line. Present, 8. Absent, 1. Your mouth goes dry. The chalk in the tray below the board looks new, bright white against the aged wood. You reach out, touch it with one finger. It's real chalk, slightly damp even, as if someone just set it down. The temperature in the room drops suddenly, noticeably, and your breath begins to fog. That's when you hear it. A child's voice, distant, singing. The melody is simple, repetitive. The kind of song elementary school children learn. You freeze listening. The voice comes from somewhere deeper in the building, maybe one of the back rooms you haven't explored yet. You tell yourself it's wind through broken boards, acoustic tricks in an old structure. But wind doesn't carry a tune. Wind doesn't sing about spelling and arithmetic. You move toward the sound, camera forgotten in your hands. The schoolhouse has two smaller rooms behind the main classroom. One was likely the teacher's office, the other a storage space. The singing grows louder as you approach, and now you can make out words. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Won't you come and play with me? The voice is high, sweet, completely out of place in this rotting shell of a building. The door to the first room is closed. You don't remember it being closed when you glanced through earlier. Your hand hovers over the knob, every instinct screaming at you to leave, to go back to your car and drive away from this place. But you've come too far, invested too much time. You turn the knob and push. The room is empty, completely empty. No furniture, no debris, just bare walls and floor. But the singing continues, louder now, and it's coming from right in front of you, from the empty air in the center of the room. You raise your camera on instinct and snap a photo, the flash illuminating the space for a split second. In that flash, you see them. Children, 7 or 8 of them, standing in a circle, holding hands, singing. They're dressed in clothing from another era, simple dresses, knickers, worn shoes. And they're all looking at you. The flash fades. The room is empty again, but the singing has stopped. Your hands shake as you check the camera's display screen. You bring up the last photo, the one you just took. Your heart stops. The children are there in the image, frozen in that moment of the flash, their faces turned toward the camera. But it's their expressions that make your blood run cold. They're smiling, all of them, with the kind of eager anticipation you see on kids' faces on the first day of school. And behind them, in the darkness of the doorway you're standing in, there's another figure. Taller, adult-sized. You can't make out the face, but you can see what they're holding, a long wooden pointer, the kind teachers used on maps and blackboards. You back out of the room, fumbling, nearly dropping your camera. The main classroom feels different now, darker despite the windows. The desks you'd thought were randomly scattered. You realize now they're arranged in a pattern, positioned as if students are still sitting in them, still facing the front, still waiting for the lesson to begin. The chalk dust that covers everything seems to shimmer in the dimming light, and you understand, with sudden, terrible clarity, that it's not just dust. It's fresh chalk, powdered and spread, as if someone has been writing on that board for years, decades, never stopping. The blackboard has changed. You're certain of it. The attendance list is different. Still 8 names, but now at the bottom, in that fresh chalk, it reads, Present, 8. Absent, 0. And below that, a new line you didn't see before, written in a child's careful hand. New student arriving today. You hear footsteps behind you. Small footsteps, multiple sets, moving in unison like a class lining up for recess. You don't turn around. You can't. Your body won't respond. The footsteps grow closer, and with them comes the smell of chalk and old paper and something else. Something like earth and decay and time folded in on itself. A small hand touches your arm, and it's cold. So cold it burns. Teacher says you're late, a child's voice whispers beside you. You force yourself to look. A little girl stands there, maybe 7 years old, wearing a faded blue dress. Her eyes are too dark, too empty, like looking into wells that have no bottom. But it's okay. We've been waiting a long time for our class to be full again. Teacher doesn't like empty desks. More children materialize around you, appearing like photographs developing in solution, going from transparent to solid. They gather in a semicircle, all watching you with those same eager, hungry expressions. Behind them, in the doorway to the back room, the tall figure emerges. The teacher. Her face is severe, locked in an expression of stern disapproval that might have been there when she died. You realize with horror, over 80 years ago. She holds the pointer like a weapon, tapping it against her palm with rhythmic precision. "Class is in session," she says, her voice like paper rustling in an empty room. "Take your seat. We have so much to learn, and we have all the time in the world. No one leaves until they've mastered every lesson." You try to move toward the door, but your legs feel heavy, weighted down by something you can't see. The children are closer now, forming a ring around you, their small hands reaching out. One of them tugs at your jacket, another touches your camera with curious fingers. "You'll like it here," a boy says, his voice flat, rehearsed. "We never go hungry. We never get cold. We never grow up. We just learn and learn and learn forever." The teacher moves to the blackboard, and you watch in paralyzed horror as she picks up the chalk and adds something to the attendance list. A 9th name. Your name. You didn't tell her your name. She couldn't know your name. But there it is, written in perfect cursive below the others, as if it had always been there. Always would be there. "Now then," she says, turning back to face the class. "Face you. Let's begin with spelling. We'll start with a simple word." She writes on the board, each letter precise and measured. TRAPPED. The front door slams shut. You hear the lock turn, though there's been no lock on that door for decades. The windows darken as if night is falling fast, too fast, swallowing the afternoon in seconds. The children take their seats, and you realize there's one empty desk, right in the front row, directly in the teacher's line of sight. The little girl who first touched you gestures to it, smiling that terrible, eager smile. "Don't worry," she whispers. "You'll learn to love it here. We all did. Eventually, you forget there was ever anywhere else to be. Time works differently in our classroom. Out there, people will look for you. They'll find your car, your camera equipment scattered on the floor, nothing else. They'll wonder what happened. But you'll still be here, learning your lessons, perfecting your penmanship, waiting for recess that never comes." The teacher taps her pointer against your empty desk. The sound echoes in the small room like a heartbeat, like a clock ticking backwards. The children begin to chant the alphabet, their voices rising in unison, filling every corner of the schoolhouse. And you understand, finally, why there are so many handprints in the dust, why the chalk never runs out, why photographers come here seeking the perfect shot and sometimes leave their equipment behind. The Govan schoolhouse never truly closed. It just changed what it teaches. And class is always in session. He found the turnoff to Molson just before sunset, a dirt road that seemed to appear only when he was already past it, forcing him to double back. The urban explorer had been documenting ghost towns across the Pacific Northwest for his blog, and Molson was supposed to be one of the best preserved. Well-maintained, the website said. Almost too well-maintained. That's what caught his attention. The road curved through wheat fields that glowed amber in the fading light, and then the town materialized ahead like something conjured from old photographs. Buildings lined both sides of a main street that looked straight out of 1900, the original saloon, the assay office, weathered homestead cabins. all arranged with the careful precision of a museum display. But what stopped him cold was the smoke rising from several chimneys and the lights visible in a few windows. The research said Molson had been abandoned since the Great Depression, the last residents leaving by the 1960s. No one lived here anymore. He parked near what looked like the old mercantile and stepped out into air that felt strangely thick, golden with pollen and something else he couldn't name. The quality of light was wrong somehow, too perfect, like a photograph taken during magic hour and frozen there. He checked his watch. 6:47 p.m. The sun hung at the horizon, painting everything in honeytones that should have been shifting, darkening, but remained stubbornly constant. Movement caught his eye. A woman emerged from the mercantile carrying a basket, wearing a long cotton dress that looked period-appropriate but far too clean, too new. She walked with purpose down the wooden boardwalk, her footsteps making no sound. He raised a hand in greeting, but she passed without acknowledgement, her eyes fixed ahead, a slight smile on her face, as if she were thinking pleasant thoughts from long ago. He followed her with his gaze, and realized there were others. A man in suspenders and a newsboy cap swept the porch of the saloon. Two children played with a wooden hoop in the street, their laughter crystalline and distant. An elderly gentleman sat in a rocking chair outside what might have been a boarding house, pipe in hand, rocking with metronomic consistency. All of them moved through their tasks with the unhurried precision of routine, of people who had performed these same actions 10,000 times before. The explorer approached the man with the pipe, documenting everything with his camera. Up close, he could see details that made his stomach clench. The man's clothes were immaculate, but decades out of style. His face unlined, yet somehow ancient. His eyes focused on something that wasn't quite the street in front of him. "Excuse me," the explorer said. "I'm looking for information about the town's history." The man continued rocking, puffing his pipe with measured breaths. Smoke curled upward in spirals that hung in the air too long, defying physics, creating patterns that seemed almost purposeful. "Fine evening," the man said finally, his voice carrying the cadence of another era. "Always a fine evening here. Been that way since 09, or was it 29? Hard to recall. Days have a way of blending together when they're all the same." Something in those words triggered a flutter of unease. The explorer glanced at his watch again. 6:47 p.m., the same time as before. He watched the second hand, but it seemed to be moving through molasses, each tick taking longer than it should. When he looked up, the light hadn't changed at all. Still that golden hour glow. Still that perfect suspended moment between day and night. He walked down the main street, camera forgotten in his hands, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The town was active, alive with residents going about their evening routines. But something was fundamentally wrong with all of it. The woman with the basket entered a building and emerged moments later with the same basket, taking the same path down the boardwalk. The children's hoop rolled in an identical arc. The man swept the same section of porch over and over, his movements looping like footage on repeat. In the window of what looked like a hotel, he saw a family having dinner. Mother, father, 3 children. They sat around a table, forks moving from plate to mouth with mechanical precision, but no one was eating. The food remained untouched, the same bites lifted and lowered endlessly. The mother's smile never wavered. The father's eyes never blinked. The children chewed nothing. The explorer's heart rate picked up, that primal instinct that something was desperately wrong. He turned to head back to his car and nearly collided with the woman with the basket. She stood directly behind him, closer than any person should have gotten without him hearing. Her smile was gentle, patient. "Lost, are you?" she asked. "Folks often get turned around here. Time moves different in Molson. Always has, ever since the mines closed. Or was it the railroad? Memory gets fuzzy." "I need to go," he said, stepping around her. But the street had changed. The buildings were the same, but their positions felt different, rearranged like chess pieces moved when he wasn't looking. His car should have been to the left. But now all he could see were more weathered facades, more windows with lights that never flickered, more residents performing their eternal routines. He broke into a run, choosing a direction at random. His footfalls made no sound on the dirt street. The air had grown thicker, resistant, like moving through water. Behind him, he heard the woman's voice, calm and unconcerned. "No use rushing. You've only just arrived. You'll want to stay for the evening. Everyone does." The town stretched around him, impossibly large for the small cluster of buildings he'd seen from the approach. Streets branched off into more streets, all lined with identical structures, all populated with residents going through their motions. He passed a blacksmith hammering an anvil in perfect rhythm. Strike, lift, strike, lift. But the metal never shaped. The sparks fell in identical patterns. A teacher led children in a song outside the old schoolhouse, their voices high and sweet. But they never reached the end of the verse, starting over at the same line each time. His watch still read 6:47 p.m. He stopped, breathing hard though he felt no exertion, no sweat on his brow despite the running. That's when he noticed his hands. They looked slightly different, slightly faded, as if he were becoming less solid. He held them up to the unchanging light and could almost see through them to the buildings beyond. "You're starting to understand." The voice came from beside him. An old woman sat on a bench he could have sworn wasn't there seconds before. Her face was kind but distant, her eyes reflecting nothing. "Time doesn't flow properly here. Hasn't since the town died. But we didn't know we died, you see. So we just kept on living. Kept on with our routines. Day after day after day. Except there are no days anymore. Just this moment, this one perfect evening, stretched out forever." He stumbled backward, his mind rejecting what she was saying. "That's impossible. You can't be." "Dead?" She laughed, a sound like wind through empty buildings. "We are and we aren't. We're caught, you might say, trapped in the last moment before we realized it was all over. The mines failed, the railroad left, the people drifted away, and somewhere in all that, we stopped being alive and started being memory. But memory doesn't know it's memory. It thinks it's still real." The explorer looked at his watch again, desperate for something concrete, something that made sense. 6:47 p.m. But now he noticed something he'd missed before. The date display. It had been October 27th when he arrived. Now it read October 29th. 2 days had passed, but he'd only been here for minutes. Hadn't he? "Time's funny here," the old woman continued, watching him with those empty, knowing eyes. "You might think you've been here 20 minutes. Your watch might say days. Both are true. Neither are true. We exist in all the moments simultaneously. Every evening we ever lived here all happening at once, overlapping, bleeding into each other." He backed away from her, turning down another street, and found himself facing a building he recognized, the Mercantile where he'd seen the woman with the basket. He'd run in a circle, or the town had rearranged itself, or he'd never left this spot at all. The distinctions were becoming harder to hold on to. His car appeared ahead, parked exactly where he'd left it. Relief flooded through him. He ran for it, fumbling for keys that felt strange in his hand, too light, too insubstantial. The door opened, and he threw himself into the driver's seat, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine turned over once, twice, then caught. But the sound was wrong, muffled, like hearing it from underwater. He looked up through the windshield and saw them, all of them. Every resident of Molson stood in the street, facing him, watching with those patient, empty expressions. The woman with the basket, the man with the pipe, the family from the dinner table, the children with the hoop. Dozens more he hadn't seen before, all materialized from the buildings, all converging in silent witness. The man with the pipe stepped forward and spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the closed car windows. You can try to leave. Some do. But you've already been here for 3 days. Check your phone. Check your camera. See how long you've really been among us. With trembling hands, the explorer pulled out his phone. The battery was dead, but the screen showed one last notification before it died. Dozens of missed calls, messages from friends and family spanning 3 days. His camera's display told the same story. Hundreds of photos taken over 72 hours, photos he didn't remember taking, all of the same scenes, the same people, the same unchanging golden light. The thing about being trapped in time, the woman with the basket said, moving closer to the car, is that eventually you forget there was ever anything else. The world outside starts to feel like the dream. This becomes real. Your name gets foggy. Your memories fade. And then one evening, this evening, every evening, you realize you're content here. Content to sweep the same porch, walk the same path, live the same moment forever. He tried to remember his name. It had been right there on the tip of his tongue seconds ago. Something common, something he'd answered to all his life. But it was slipping away like water through fingers, leaving only the fuzzy impression of what it might have been. The engine died. He turned the key again, but nothing happened. The car had become part of the town now, another artifact from another era, another piece of the eternal museum display. Through the mirror, he could see new smoke rising from his car's exhaust, frozen in spiral patterns that never dissipated, just like the smoke from the old man's pipe. Don't fight it, the teacher said, the one from the schoolhouse. She stood at his window now, her hand resting gently on the glass. Fighting makes it worse, makes the forgetting painful, better to accept. We all did eventually. Even John Molson himself is here somewhere, walking these streets, living his perfect evening. Can't recall which one he is anymore, but he's here. They all are. Everyone who ever loved this place. The explorer, he could still think of himself as that, even if the specifics were getting hazy. Looked at his hands again. Definitely more transparent now. He could see the steering wheel through his palms, the dashboard through his wrists. He was becoming like them, becoming memory, becoming a resident of this moment outside time. He tried one more time to remember why he'd come here, what he'd been looking for. Something about photography, documentation. The reasons felt distant, unimportant compared to the comfortable lethargy settling over him. The town did look beautiful in this light. The perfect preservation of it all, the peace of routine, the absence of worry about tomorrow because tomorrow never came. There was something appealing about that, something almost comforting. There we are, the old woman said, smiling. You're getting it now. Welcome home. You'll find your place here soon enough. Maybe you'll be the photographer on the porch, taking pictures that never develop. Maybe you'll be the traveler arriving for the first time, over and over. The town needs different people, different roles. You'll find yours. His watch had finally stopped at 6:47 p.m. The date display flickered and went blank. Time had finished with him, had absorbed him fully into its loop. He opened the car door and stepped out into that golden, eternal light. The residents smiled their patient smiles and returned to their routines, making space for him, the newest member of Molson's permanent population. Somewhere far away, in a world that felt increasingly like a dream, people would look for him. They'd find his car parked on a dirt road near an old ghost town museum. They'd find his equipment scattered inside, his phone dead, his last known location logged days ago. They'd search the empty buildings and restored facades and find nothing but dust and historical plaques and the wind whistling through gaps in old wood. They'd wonder what happened, where he went, why he disappeared without a trace. But he'd be there the whole time, living his moment, walking his path through an eternal evening in Molson. Just another ghost who forgot that he died. Just another resident who lost his name to the town that time forgot. And every sunset that never quite fades, he'll be there, smiling that patient smile, waiting for the next visitor who gets turned around on the back roads of northeastern Washington, who finds a town that shouldn't exist, who stays just a moment too long in the golden light. Because in Molson, everyone arrives at 6:47 p.m., and no one ever leaves. The hiking group reached Monte Cristo just as the weather turned. 4 of them had started the trail at Barlow Pass that morning under clear skies, following the old mining road through forest so dense it swallowed sound. They'd come prepared for a day hike, water, snacks, first aid kit, not expecting to still be here when the temperature dropped 20 degrees in 20 minutes and snow began falling in sheets so thick they couldn't see 10 feet ahead. The storm came from nowhere, a wall of white that descended from the peaks like something alive and purposeful. One moment they were photographing the rusted remains of the old concentrator mill, and the next they were stumbling through a blizzard that had no business existing in October. The leader made the call quickly. Seek shelter in one of the remaining structures and wait it out. Weather in the Cascades could be unpredictable, but storms this severe usually passed within hours. They chose what looked like an old bunkhouse, its walls still mostly intact, roof sagging but holding. Inside smelled of wet wood and something else, something organic and ancient that made their noses wrinkle. The temperature inside was barely warmer than outside, but at least they were out of the wind that had begun to howl through the abandoned town, with a sound that was almost vocal, almost words. The youngest of them, a college student doing research on Pacific Northwest ghost towns, pulled out her phone. No signal. That wasn't surprising given the remoteness and the storm. But something about the complete absence of bars felt wrong. The GPS showed their location accurately. Monte Cristo town site, elevation 2,800 feet. But the weather data displayed impossible readings. Temperature, -40. Wind speed, sustained at 90 miles per hour. Those numbers would mean certain death outside, yet they'd just walked in from conditions that had been merely dangerous, not apocalyptic. The wind outside intensified, battering the bunkhouse walls with rhythmic force. The leader suggested they conserve body heat, huddle together, ration their water. Standard survival protocol. They'd be fine once the storm passed. The old mining town had weathered worse over its century of abandonment. They pulled on extra layers and settled in to wait, trying not to think about the 4-mile hike back to their vehicles or how quickly night would fall. That's when they heard the digging. It came from beneath them, from under the floorboards that were already rotted through in places. a methodical scraping and scratching, like something with claws or tools working through earth and rock. The sound was too organized to be animals, too purposeful to be anything natural. The four of them froze, listening as the digging moved in a pattern beneath the bunkhouse, circling them, testing the foundation. The researcher pulled up her notes about Monte Cristo on her phone, reading by the dim light filtering through cracks in the walls. The town had died in 1907, she reminded them, not from any single disaster, but from accumulated failures. Mines that went dry, funding that disappeared, a railroad that flooded too often to maintain. But there were other stories too, ones not included in official histories. Reports from miners in the 1890s about sounds in the deep shafts, about tunnels that went places they shouldn't, about something that had been disturbed when they dug too deep into the mountain's heart. One miner's journal, she read aloud, described finding scratches on the inside of tunnel walls. Not marks from pickaxes, but something else. Something that had scraped the rock from within, as if trying to dig out rather than in. The final entry, dated March 1906, simply said, "The mountain is alive. It's always been alive. We thought we were mining it. We were wrong." The mine referenced was sealed shortly after, officially due to structural instability. Unofficially, 3 miners had gone in and never come out. The digging stopped. The silence that followed was worse, pregnant with expectation. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but the wind had taken on new qualities. Patterns that sounded like breathing, exhalations that rattled the walls. The temperature dropped further, their breath fogging in thick clouds that hung in the air too long, refusing to dissipate. The oldest member of the group, a seasoned outdoorsman who'd hiked these mountains for 30 years, moved to the window to check conditions. What he saw made him step back, hand going to his mouth. The snow outside was falling upward. Flakes rose from the ground toward the sky in defiance of gravity, creating a vortex that spiraled around the bunkhouse. And in that swirling white, shapes moved. Tall, thin figures that might have been trees bent by wind. Except trees didn't move with that kind of fluid purpose. "We need to leave," he said quietly. "Now. Storm or no storm, we need to get out of here." But when they opened the door, the storm intensified instantly, wind hitting them with physical force that drove them back inside. The snow wasn't just falling or rising anymore. It was attacking, whipping around them with targeted fury, stinging exposed skin like needles. They slammed the door shut, and the storm immediately calmed to its previous level, as if satisfied they'd made the right choice to stay. "It's keeping us here," the researcher whispered, her voice shaking. "The storm. It's not weather. It's a response. Like an immune system." The scratching resumed, louder now, coming from the walls as well as the floor. They could see the wood flexing inward in places, as if something on the other side was pressing against it, testing its strength. The seasoned hiker pulled out his hunting knife. Inadequate against whatever this was, but having a weapon made him feel marginally less helpless. Then one of them vanished. The fourth member, who'd been standing near the back corner examining the scratches on the wall, was simply gone. No scream, no struggle. Just there one moment and absent the next. Where she'd stood, a hole gaped in the floorboards, edges ragged and fresh, wood torn upward from below. The hole was just wide enough for a person, and from its depths came a smell like earth and decay and something else. Something that had never known sunlight. They called her name, voices breaking with panic, but received only echoes that sounded wrong, that came back distorted and delayed. The seasoned hiker shined his flashlight down the hole. and the beam revealed not floor joists and foundation, but a tunnel, a carved passage that descended at a steep angle into darkness, walls marked with those same scratches the journal had described. Gouges that ran parallel like claw marks from something with too many fingers. From deep in that tunnel came a sound, their missing companion's voice, but flat, emotionless, speaking in a language that predated human speech. The syllables were wrong, the cadence alien, the meaning incomprehensible but somehow fundamentally threatening. Then another voice joined hers, and another, and another. A chorus of speakers reciting something that might have been an invitation or a warning or a spell that had been old when the mountains were young. The chanting grew louder, closer, rising from the tunnel and from beneath the entire bunkhouse. The building began to shift, tilting slightly as if the ground beneath was becoming unstable. Dirt started trickling through gaps in the floorboards, and with it came things that weren't dirt. Pale, segmented things that writhed and withdrew, protrusions that might have been fingers or roots or something with no earthly comparison. The mines, the researcher gasped, understanding flooding her features with horror. They didn't dig too deep. They dug into something. Something that was already here, already alive, already aware. The mountain isn't a mountain. It's housing something. The mines were wounds. We sealed them, but it's still here. Still conscious, still. The roof tore away, not from wind, but from below, the entire structure lifting as if something enormous was rising beneath them, surfacing after decades of patient waiting. In the whiteout conditions above, they caught glimpses of what held them. Appendages that might have been roots or tentacles, or the architecture of something that had learned to wear the mountain's shape, that had become the mountain over millions of years, turning stone and ore into extensions of its incomprehensible form. The leader and the seasoned hiker ran, abandoning the bunkhouse as it collapsed inward, pulled down into a sinkhole that opened with horrifying speed. The storm seemed to part for them, creating a corridor of visibility that led toward the old mine entrance marked Mystery Mine on the trail signs. They had seconds to choose. Brave the storm, with no shelter and likely freeze, or take refuge in the one place that might offer protection from what was outside. They chose the mine. In retrospect, it was exactly what they were supposed to choose. The tunnel was timber-braced and relatively stable, descending into the mountain at a gentle grade. Their flashlights illuminated rust-colored walls and the remnants of old rail tracks. Behind them, the entrance remained clear. No collapse, no pursuing horror, just the distant howl of the storm. It seemed safe. That was the trap. As they moved deeper, they began to notice details that didn't fit. The scratch marks weren't just on walls, but on the ceiling, coming from above, from inside the rock. The timber supports showed signs of pressure from the wrong direction, as if the mountain had tried to squeeze them from within. And the air grew warmer rather than cooler, carrying that same organic smell from the bunkhouse, but stronger, almost suffocating in its intensity. They found the camp a quarter-mile in, evidence that their missing companion had been here, or something wearing her form had made it appear that way. Her backpack, her jacket, her phone showing a video recording still in progress. The seasoned hiker picked up the phone with shaking hands and pressed play. The video showed their companion's face, but her eyes were wrong. Too dark, too deep, reflecting light in a way human eyes shouldn't. She spoke, but not with her voice. "The mountain keeps what enters it," the thing wearing her said. "You were called here. The storm was an invitation. The town is a lure. We've learned over centuries how to draw prey into the deep places. Some we keep for knowledge. Some we transform. Some we simply hold forever, witnesses to what dwells in the spaces between stone. Behind her in the video, the tunnel walls moved. The rock itself rippled like water, and within it, shapes became briefly visible. Hundreds of them, thousands. Bodies preserved in stone like insects in amber. Miners and hikers and animals and things that had never been either, all suspended in the living rock, all still aware, all still conscious, trapped in the mountain's slow geological dreaming. The video ended. The phone's battery died. And in the darkness that followed before their flashlights compensated, they heard the sound of rock grinding against rock, of the tunnel constricting, of the mountain remembering it was alive. And they were inside it, had been inside it since they entered Monte Cristo's perimeter, had been digested slowly from the moment the storm descended. The walls began to close. Not quickly, but with the inexorable patience of something that measured time in epochs rather than seconds. The timber supports groaned and splintered, unable to resist the pressure. The two survivors ran back toward the entrance, flashlights bouncing wildly, illuminating passages that branched off into darkness, revealing other victims suspended in the walls, their faces frozen in eternal moments of realization. They emerged from the mine into conditions that had worsened impossibly. The storm had consumed Monte Cristo entirely, transforming the ghost town into something from another world. Buildings stood where they shouldn't be, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. The sky above swirled with colors that had no names. And everywhere, carved into every surface, were those scratches. Messages in a language older than language. Warnings no one had understood in time. The researcher's voice crackled over the radio they'd forgotten they had. She was still down there, still in the mine, still being integrated into something vast and ancient. "It showed me," she said, words distorted by distance and transformation. "The mountain, what it really is. Why the mines failed. The ore they found was fragments of its consciousness. They were digging through its thoughts, extracting pieces of its memory. It let them curious about these small things that had learned to use tools. But curiosity fades. Hunger doesn't." The two survivors made a decision born of desperation and horror. They ran into the storm, abandoning shelter, accepting death by freezing over death by integration. The wind tore at them. The snow blinded them. The cold bit through every layer with ruthless efficiency. They stumbled down what they hoped was the trail back to Barlow Pass. Navigation impossible. Direction a guess. Survival a prayer. They were found 3 days later by a search and rescue team, miles from where they should have been, suffering from severe hypothermia and frostbite. They recovered physically, but never mentally, never able to fully explain what happened at Monte Cristo. The storm, they said. Something in the mountain. The mines weren't empty. The other two were never found. Added to the list of hikers who vanished in the Cascades, their disappearance attributed to exposure or falling through unstable mine shafts, or the dozens of other dangers that wait in the wilderness. But sometimes, on clear days when hikers visit the Monte Cristo ghost town, they report feeling watched. They notice the old mine entrances seem to breathe, exhaling air that's warm and carries the scent of things buried deep. They see scratches on surfaces that weren't there in photographs from last week. And they get the unmistakable feeling that the mountain is aware of them, has noticed their presence, has filed them away as potential curiosities or meals or additions to its vast collection of the consumed. You've been tracking the signal for 3 weeks now, ever since it first appeared on your spectrum analyzer at 3:33 a.m. a frequency that shouldn't exist, broadcasting from coordinates that lead to nothing but abandoned railroad tracks and forest. The signal is strong, coherent, and impossibly clear for something originating from the middle of nowhere. What makes it disturbing isn't the static or the distortion. It's how clean it sounds, how deliberate, and how it seems to know things it shouldn't. The drive to Leicester takes you up old logging roads that haven't seen maintenance in decades, past the locked gates meant to keep people away from Tacoma's watershed. Your radio equipment bounces in the passenger seat as you navigate ruts and washouts, following GPS coordinates that match the signal's triangulated source. The town died officially in 2002 when its last resident passed away, but the buildings were demolished in 2017. There's nothing left but foundations and forest reclaiming what was once a thriving railroad hub. Except for the radio tower. You spot it through the trees as you round the final curve, a skeletal structure rising above the canopy, rust-red and impossibly intact. It shouldn't be here. Leicester never had a broadcast tower. It was too remote, too small. Yet there it stands, guy wires singing in the wind, and at its peak, lights that pulse in sequence. Red, white, active lights, on a tower that has no power source. You park where the road ends up and gather your equipment. The RF meter starts screaming before you even turn it on, needles slamming into the red as electromagnetic radiation saturates the air. These readings should be impossible, the kind of exposure that causes tissue damage, that disrupts neural function. Yet you feel fine. Better than fine, actually. Energized, alert. Your thoughts have a crystalline clarity you haven't experienced since college. The tower's base sits in a clearing where the old depot once stood, surrounded by concrete foundations like gravestones for buildings that no longer exist. Your equipment picks up the broadcast clearly now, and you plug in headphones to listen. At first, it's just carrier tone, pure sine wave at 153.8 MHz, a frequency reserved for emergency services but showing no traffic for years. Then, at exactly 3:33 p.m., the tone modulates and a voice begins to speak. It's reading numbers, just numbers, in a flat masculine voice with no emotion. 4712539824140. A pause. Then more numbers. You recognize the pattern immediately. It's a numbers station, like the Cold War-era broadcasts used for communicating with spies. Except those are all accounted for, documented. This one exists in no database. Broadcasts from a tower that isn't supposed to exist in a town that's been dead for over 20 years. You set up your recording equipment, documenting everything. The signal strength is extraordinary, broadcasting at power levels that would require industrial generators, yet there's no infrastructure here, no fuel source, no cables. The tower itself looks ancient, pre-1950s construction, but the lights are LED technology, bright and modern, and consuming electricity from nowhere. The voice continues its recitation. You transcribe the numbers, looking for patterns, codes, meaning. That's when you notice your own voice recorder has been running for 3 hours, even though you only arrived 20 minutes ago. The timestamp shows 6:33 p.m., but your phone insists it's 3:52 p.m. You check your watch. It stopped at 3:33, second-hand frozen mid-sweep. The voice on the broadcast pauses. Then it says something different, something that makes your blood freeze. You arrived at 3:47. You're wearing a blue jacket. Your name is... And it says your name. Your full name, middle initial included. You're here to find the source. You found it. Now you'll understand why you should have stayed away. You rip off the headphones, but the voice continues. Not from the headphones, but from the tower itself, amplified through speakers you can't see, echoing through the clearing. The tower was built in 1983, 1 year after the railroad stopped using these tracks. It was never on any map, never in any records. It exists in the spaces between documentation, broadcasting to frequencies no one monitors, saying things no one was supposed to hear. Your RF meter is showing readings that violate physics. Negative radiation values, electromagnetic fields flowing in impossible directions, wavelengths that shouldn't propagate through air. The tower's lights pulse faster now, and with each pulse you feel something change. A slight disorientation, a sense of time skipping like a scratched record. You're wondering how I know your name. The voice continues, now coming from your own equipment, from devices you know are powered off. I know because you told me. You told me yesterday, which for you is tomorrow. Time works differently here. The broadcasts don't travel through space, they travel through time. Every transmission is a loop, a message sent backward and forward simultaneously, creating paradoxes that fold reality like paper. You try to leave, but the clearing has changed. Your car is still there, but it looks different. Newer, cleaner, and there's someone sitting in the driver's seat. You. Another version of you, staring straight ahead, hands gripping the steering wheel, mouth moving in silent words. You approach slowly, and the figure doesn't react, doesn't acknowledge your presence. On the dashboard, your equipment shows recordings, dozens of files, all dated days from now, all containing conversations you haven't had yet. Station KLEs, the voice announces, using call letters that don't exist. Broadcasting from Leicester, Washington, where the railroad carried more than cargo, where the telegraph lines picked up signals from places that don't have signals, where an operator named Lester Hansaker disappeared in 1939 after reporting he could hear the future through the wire. You know that name. Lester Hansaker was the telegraph operator the town was named after. But the records say he died of natural causes, not disappeared. Yet here's his voice, or something using his voice, broadcasting from a tower that shouldn't exist, claiming a history that doesn't match any documentation. The voice changes tone, becomes urgent. In 30 seconds, you're going to run for your car. In 45 seconds, the engine won't start. In 2 minutes, you'll return to the tower base and find the hatch. Don't open the hatch. I'm telling you this now, so you'll remember later that you were warned, that you knew, that what happens next is your choice and your responsibility. You don't wait for 30 seconds. You run now, yanking open the car door, the real car, not the one with your double inside, and jam the key into the ignition. The engine turns over once, twice, then dies with a mechanical wheeze that sounds almost apologetic. You try again. Nothing. The electronics are dead, the dashboard dark. And when you check your phone for help, the screen shows a video you don't remember recording. You press play. It's you, filmed from your phone's perspective, standing exactly where you are now. I know you're watching this, the video you says. I recorded it 10 minutes from now. The tower isn't broadcasting radio waves. It's broadcasting causality. Effect before cause, future informing past. The operator who built it discovered that electromagnetic radiation could carry more than information. It could carry time itself, fold it, loop it, make yesterday and tomorrow exist in the same moment. The video continues. You're going to find the hatch. You're going to open it despite the warning. You're going to descend into the broadcast station and learn why Lester was really abandoned, why the last resident stayed until she died, because she was trying to contain what's down there, to keep people away, to prevent what you're about to discover. Behind you, the tower hums with increasing intensity, a sound that vibrates in your chest, in your skull, in places sound shouldn't reach. You turn and see it. The hatch, right where the voice said it would be, set into the concrete foundation at the tower's base. It's locked with a chain that looks decades old. But when you touch it, the lock opens in your hand as if it's been waiting for you. The hatch swings open on oiled hinges, revealing stairs descending into darkness lit by emergency strips that glow an unsettling green. Your equipment, still in the car, begins transmitting on its own. You can hear it broadcasting your vital signs, your location, the timestamp that now reads 5 different times simultaneously. You descend because you have to, because the broadcast told you that you would, because fighting a predetermined future feels impossible when you've already seen yourself do it. The stairs go down 40 feet, far deeper than any basement should extend, ending in a chamber that makes no architectural sense. It's too large, too sophisticated, filled with equipment that ranges from vacuum tubes to technology you don't recognize. Machines that hum and calculate and display readouts in languages that aren't quite alphanumeric. In the center sits a broadcast console, and in the chair, a figure, or what's left of one. The skeletal remains wear a telegraph operator's uniform from the 1930s, and on the desk before the skeleton sits an open logbook. You approach, knowing you shouldn't, unable to stop yourself. The logbook's last entry is dated September 14th, 1939, the day Lester Hansaker died. The entry reads, "I've been broadcasting for decades now, though from my perspective, it's only been days. The equipment doesn't transmit in space, it transmits in time, every broadcast arriving before it's sent, every reception occurring after the source has gone silent. I'm trapped in my own loop, my death and my life happening simultaneously, and everyone who finds this station joins the loop. They become part of the broadcast, their timeline folding into the transmission, past and future bleeding together until there's no distinction. The equipment activates around you, displays lighting up, speakers crackling to life. The voice returns, but now you recognize it. It's your voice, older, tired, speaking from years ahead. You've been here for 3 days now. You think it's been minutes, but look at your phone. Look at the date. You're part of the broadcast now, part of the loop that keeps this station active, keeps it transmitting across decades, drawing more people in to sustain the paradox. Your phone screen shows October 30th, 3 days later than when you arrived. But you've been here for how long? The memories are confused, overlapping. You remember arriving today. You remember being here for weeks. Both are true. Neither are true. The console before you displays a transmission queue, and you see your own messages scheduled for broadcast, messages you haven't written yet, messages that were received yesterday. Among them, one catches your eye. A transmission dated today, 3 weeks ago, sent to your home address. The message that first alerted you to this station's existence. You sent it to yourself. You lured yourself here. The loop closes perfectly. The station needs operators. Your future voice continues from the speakers. Lester knew this when he built it. The equipment runs on temporal energy, on the paradoxes it creates, on the folded timelines of everyone who finds it. We become the power source, living our moments out of sequence, broadcasting ourselves forward and backward until we can't remember which way time flows or if it flows at all. You try to leave, climbing the stairs back to the surface, but the exit is gone. Just more. Stairs descending deeper, looping back to the chamber you just left. The hatch closed behind you, or it never opened, or you never descended. All versions exist simultaneously in this place, where cause and effect have lost their meaning. The broadcast continues. You'll learn to operate the equipment. You already have, There are transcripts dated years from now with your handwriting, showing you'll be here a long time, sending messages, receiving responses from yourself at different points, maintaining the loop. Eventually, you'll stop fighting it. You'll accept that you're both free and trapped, dead and alive, arriving and departing all at once. Somewhere above, in the clearing that exists in normal time, search parties will eventually find your car, your equipment still recording, batteries that should have died weeks ago still showing full charges. They'll find no trace of you, no explanation, just the tower that doesn't appear on any maps and the broadcasts that occur at 3:33 a.m., carrying numbers and voices and sometimes, if they listen carefully, your voice warning them away, telling them not to come looking, knowing they will anyway, because you already sent them the message that brought them here. The station broadcasts forever. The loop never ends. And you're part of it now, your timeline fractured across decades, speaking to yourself from the future, warning yourself in the past, trapped in the eternal present of Lester's last transmission. The folklore researcher arrived in Liberty on a Thursday afternoon, though the town had been officially dead since 1938. The grant funding his thesis on Pacific Northwest agricultural festivals had led him here, to a ghost town that supposedly once hosted one of the region's most elaborate harvest celebrations. He expected empty buildings and historical markers. Instead, he found lights. String lights crisscrossed the main street, bulbs glowing warm yellow despite the lack of power lines. Bunting in autumn colors, deep orange, burgundy, gold, decorated every storefront, looking far too fresh for decorations that should have been rotting for nearly 90 years. Music drifted from somewhere deeper in town, a fiddle and accordion playing folk tunes that belonged to another century. The researcher parked his car near what had been the general store and stepped out into air that smelled of cinnamon, wood smoke, and something underneath it all that was distinctly organic, distinctly wrong. Liberty's main street stretched before him, lined with buildings in various states of preservation. But what caught his attention were the people. Dozens of them, dressed in period clothing from the 1930s, moving through the street with purpose, hanging more decorations, arranging hay bales, setting up what looked like game booths. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of a community preparing for celebration, and not one of them acknowledged his presence. He approached a woman arranging apples in a barrel for a bobbing station. Up close, he could see details that made his academic curiosity curdle into something colder. Her dress was immaculate, perfectly pressed, but her skin had a waxy quality, like preserved fruit. Her smile was fixed, stretched too wide, and when she reached for another apple, her wrist bent at an angle that was anatomically impossible. The joint had been broken and never healed, yet she continued her task with cheerful determination. "Excuse me," the researcher said, his voice sounding too loud, too modern. The woman didn't respond, didn't even pause in her work. She placed apples with mechanical precision, the same motion repeated endlessly, and he noticed the barrel was already full. She was simply rearranging the same fruit over and over. A man walked past, carrying a banner that read, "Liberty Harvest Festival 1936, in hand-painted letters. The banner looked brand new despite the date, and the man carrying it had no eyes, just empty sockets that somehow still conveyed the impression of focus, of purpose. He whistled along with the music, a jaunty tune that felt obscene coming from that ruined face. The researcher pulled out his notebook, training taking over despite the growing sense that he'd made a terrible mistake coming here. He documented what he saw, the decorations, the residents, the impossible preservation of a festival that should have ended 9 decades ago. His pen trembled as he wrote. And when he looked up, the street had filled with more people. They emerged from buildings, from around corners, all dressed for celebration, all moving with that same uncanny purpose. The music grew louder, and he realized it was coming from the town square ahead. Against every survival instinct, his academic curiosity pulled him forward. He had to understand what this was, had to document this impossible survival of folk tradition. The square opened before him, and what he saw would have been charming in any other context. A bandstand decorated with cornstalks and pumpkins, long tables laden with food, a dance floor marked out with chalk, and dozens of residents gathering for what was clearly the festival's main event. A banner hung across the bandstand. Welcome to the 89th Annual Liberty Harvest Festival. But that was wrong. If the festival started in 1936 and it was now 2025, this would be... His mind struggled with the math. This would be celebrating far more years than had actually passed. Unless they'd been celebrating every single night since 1936, counting each performance as its own annual event. The thought made his stomach clench. The dancers began their performance, and that's when the full horror became apparent. They moved in traditional folk dance patterns, circles and lines, partners swapping with practiced precision. But their bodies were wrong. Broken necks that caused heads to loll at sickening angles, limbs that bent backward at joints. One woman's entire torso twisted impossibly. Yet she continued to dance, smile fixed in place, moving through steps she'd performed thousands upon thousands of times. The researcher stumbled backward, notebook falling from nerveless fingers. The dancers noticed the movement. Every head turned toward him in perfect unison, those fixed smiles widening, empty eyes, or misaligned eyes, or eyes that had filmed over with death, all focusing on him with unmistakable hunger. The music stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. "Fresh face," someone whispered, and the words rippled through the crowd, repeated by dozens of voices in tones ranging from childlike excitement to ancient hunger. Fresh face for the finale. Fresh face for the dance. The festival needs fresh faces. They began moving toward him with terrifying coordination, not running but walking with inevitable purpose. The researcher turned and ran, his footsteps echoing off buildings that seemed to close in around him, streets rearranging themselves into a maze designed to channel him back toward the square, back toward the celebration that demanded his participation. He reached his car, yanked the door open, jammed the key in the ignition. The engine turned over once, coughed, and died. He tried again, pumping the gas, pleading with machinery that had worked perfectly an hour ago. Nothing. Through the windshield, he could see them coming, the festival goers, the eternal celebrants, moving in a wave of period clothing and broken bodies and fixed smiles that promised he would join them, would become part of the tradition, would dance at the harvest festival forever. A man appeared beside his window, ancient, wearing a suit that might have been fashionable in 1936, his face dignified despite the visible decay. "The festival must go on," he said, his voice cultured, reasonable. "We've celebrated every night since the barn collapsed, since the rafters fell and took 32 of us in one terrible moment. But we didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The celebration had been planned for months. The food was prepared. The decorations hung. So we continued. We continue still. We always will." The researcher's hand found the door lock, but the man wasn't trying to open it. He simply stood there, explaining with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. "We need new participants occasionally. The dances require certain numbers. certain formations. Some of us have deteriorated too much to perform our roles. You're young, strong. You'll dance beautifully for decades before you wear out. I won't, the researcher gasped, trying the ignition again. Still nothing. The car's electronics were dead, the radio displaying nothing but static, and through that static he heard music. The same fiddle and accordion, playing from his own speakers, playing from inside the car, inside his head. You already are, the man said gently. You've been here for 3 hours, though it feels like minutes. Time moves differently during the festival. It's always evening, always the perfect temperature, always the moment right before the celebration reaches its peak. And that peak requires a finale, requires fresh blood and fresh joy, and someone who hasn't yet learned to smile through the pain of broken bones and centuries of repetition. The researcher looked at his watch. It go 47 p.m. But he'd arrived at 2:15 p.m. The sun still hung at the same angle, that perfect golden hour light that made everything look warm and inviting. Time had stopped, or looped, or twisted into something that no longer flowed in just one direction. Hands pressed against his windows, dozens of them, hundreds, the entire town gathering around his car. They weren't violent, weren't trying to break in. They were simply waiting, patient as only the dead can be patient, knowing he would eventually have to come out, have to join them, have to take his place in the formation that required his participation. The researcher's phone showed no signal, but when he opened his photos, he found images he didn't remember taking. Pictures of himself dancing in the square, dressed in period clothing, his smile too wide, his eyes empty, his body moving through steps he didn't know to music that would never end. The timestamps showed dates from tomorrow, next week, next year. He was looking at his future, at his inevitable integration into the festival's eternal celebration. The barn collapsed during the grand finale. The dignified man continued, his voice carrying easily through the closed windows. 32 dead in an instant. But the survivors refused to acknowledge it. They continued dancing around the bodies, continued celebrating, convinced that if they maintained the festival's joy, the dead would wake up and join them. Day after day, they danced, week after week, until they too began to die. From exhaustion, from starvation, from the refusal to accept that the celebration had become a funeral. And still they danced. The researcher tried the door handle, thinking perhaps he could run, but the doors wouldn't open. Child locks engaged by invisible hands, the windows wouldn't roll down. The car had become his cage, and outside, the festival-goers began their ritual again. The music started, the dancers moved into formation, and in the center of the square, they left a space shaped exactly like him. You can join willingly, the man offered. It's easier that way. The breaking is less painful when you don't resist. Your bones will heal in the pattern the dance requires. Your smile will fix itself in place. And the joy, the eternal joy of celebration, will replace all the fear and confusion. You'll understand that this is privilege, not punishment. To be part of tradition that never ends, community that never fractures, festival that never disappoints. The car began to move. Not forward or backward, but sinking, settling into earth that had become soft, that was pulling the vehicle down into the ground as if the town itself was swallowing it. The researcher pounded on the windows, screaming for help that wouldn't come, watching as the town's surface rose to meet his eye level, then surpassed it. He was being buried alive, pulled down into the same earth that had claimed liberty decades ago. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was the festival-goers above, waving cheerfully, their broken bodies dancing in celebration of his arrival, of his inevitable transformation. of the fresh face that would allow their tradition to continue for another few decades before they needed another replacement. When the search party found his car 3 days later, it was parked neatly by the general store, doors locked, keys in the ignition. His phone showed he'd been there for less than an hour. His notebook lay on the passenger seat, filled with increasingly frantic observations that ended mid-sentence. They're all dead, but they don't know they're dead, and now they want me to... The car's radio wouldn't turn off, playing fiddle and accordion on a loop, and in the back seat they found a costume. Period clothing from the 1930s, sized perfectly for the missing researcher, as if waiting for him to return and put it on and take his place in the formation. Sometimes, hikers report hearing music from Liberty's ruins, folk tunes and laughter and the sound of many feet moving in rhythm. And if they're foolish enough to investigate during that golden hour light when the sun refuses to set, they might see figures dancing in the empty square, might recognize faces from missing person reports spanning decades, might notice that one space in the formation, always one space, waiting to be filled. The festival never ends. It only needs fresh participants to keep the tradition alive. And the celebration always needs a finale. The reservation confirmation looked legitimate. Professionally designed email, secure payment processing, even a personalized welcome message from the concierge. The travel blogger had booked 3 nights at the Columbia Southern Hotel in Shaniko, Oregon, excited to feature this beautifully restored historic property in her blog about hidden gems of the Pacific Northwest. What she didn't know was that the hotel had closed permanently in 1963, and the website she'd booked through didn't exist outside of the moment she'd accessed it. Shaniko appeared through the high desert haze exactly as the travel photos had promised. A preserved ghost town with weathered wooden buildings lining a dusty main street. But the hotel stood out, immaculate and imposing, its 3-story Victorian facade freshly painted in cream and burgundy. Lights glowed in the windows despite the early afternoon hour, and a tasteful sign by the entrance read, Columbia Southern Hotel, Est 1900, welcoming guests since our restoration. She pulled into the small parking area, noting only one other vehicle, a sedan that looked vaguely vintage, though she couldn't place the model. The blogger grabbed her overnight bag and camera equipment, already composing the opening paragraph of her review in her mind. The attention to period detail was remarkable. The front door featured authentic brass fixtures, and when she pushed it open, a bell chimed with crystalline clarity. The lobby took her breath away. Polished mahogany reception desk, Persian rugs over gleaming hardwood, a grandfather clock ticking steadily in the corner. Everything looked period-appropriate, yet impossibly pristine, as if the hotel had been frozen in 1963 and just now awakened. A chandelier cast warm light across furnishings that showed no wear, no fading, no signs of the decades that should have marked them. The concierge appeared from a back office, a middle-aged man in a perfectly pressed suit, his smile professional but somehow distant, as if he were looking through her rather than at her. "Welcome to the Columbia Southern," he said, his voice carrying an odd echo in the carpeted space. "We've been expecting you. Your room is ready." She approached the desk, pulling out her phone to show the confirmation, but he waved it away. No need. Room 237, 2nd floor, end of the hall. Dinner is served at 7, breakfast at 8. Please note that checkout is at noon, though." He paused, his smile widening slightly. "Very few guests actually check out. They find our hospitality too compelling to leave." Something in his phrasing made her pause, but she dismissed it as quirky marketing. Small, historic hotels often leaned into their mystique. She accepted the actual metal key he offered. No modern key cards here, and headed for the stairs. The elevator was period accurate, wrought iron cage style, but the concierge suggested the stairs would be more atmospheric. The second floor hallway stretched longer than it should have given the building's exterior dimensions. Sconce lights flickered with what she assumed was intentional ambiance, casting shadows that seemed to move independently. Room 237 was indeed at the end, the brass number plate polished to a mirror's shine. Inside, the room was exquisite. Four-poster bed with crisp linens, antique writing desk, claw-foot bathtub visible through the bathroom doorway. A carafe of water sat on the nightstand beside a handwritten note. "Welcome. Sleep well. Time passes differently here. You'll understand soon enough." She photographed the note, thinking it was a charming touch, and checked her watch. 2:04, 17 p.m. She spent the afternoon exploring and photographing, documenting the hotel's remarkable preservation. The common areas were empty, but felt lived in, as if guests had just stepped away. A book lay open on a reading table in the library. A game of solitaire spread across a card table in the sitting room. Steam rose from a cup of coffee in the dining room, though she'd seen no one since arriving. At 7 p.m. sharp, she descended for dinner. The dining room had transformed, candles lit, table settings arranged for multiple guests, though she saw no one else. The same concierge appeared, now dressed as a waiter, and seated her at a small table. "Our other guests dine at different times," he explained when she asked. Different times indeed. The meal appeared without her ordering. Perfectly prepared salmon, roasted vegetables, wine she didn't request. Everything tasted slightly off. Not bad, but not quite right. Flavors that were close approximations of food rather than food itself. She ate little, unease building, and excused herself back to her room. That's when she noticed her watch had stopped at 7:33 p.m. Her phone showed 7:33 as well, frozen despite being fully charged. She tried restarting it, but the time remained fixed. Outside her window, the light hadn't changed. Still that perfect golden hour glow she'd arrived in, sun hanging at the same angle above the desert hills. A knock at her door made her jump. She opened it to find another guest, a man in clothing that looked contemporary, yet somehow dated, his expression pleasant but empty. "Thought I'd introduce myself," he said. "Been here 3 days myself, or maybe 3 weeks. Hard to keep track. You're in 237? I'm in 241. Good room. Quiet. You'll like it here." "How long are you staying?" she asked, noting his eyes had that same distant quality as the concierge's, focused on something beyond her. "Oh, I checked out yesterday," he said casually. "And the day before that. And the day before that. Funny thing about checkout, you can leave your room, pack your bags, walk to your car, and somehow you're back in your room again, unpacking. The hotel likes us here. Needs us here." He walked away before she could respond, his footsteps making no sound on the carpet. She locked her door and tried, calling for help, but her phone showed no signal despite claiming full connectivity. Text messages sent but never delivered. She opened her laptop. Same issue. Internet connected but reaching nowhere. Pages loading blank or showing content from decades ago. Sleep seemed impossible, but exhaustion took her around what her stopped watch insisted was 7:33 p.m. She dreamed of the hotel filled with guests, hundreds of them, all moving through the same routines, checking in, dining, retiring to rooms, waking, repeating. In the dream, she saw herself among them, performing the same loop for eternity, her smile growing more fixed and distant with each repetition. She woke to knocking. The concierge stood outside with breakfast on a cart. "Good morning. It's 8 o'clock. Check-out is at noon, though of course we hope you'll extend your stay. Most guests do, in fact." He consulted a ledger. "You're scheduled for check-out today and tomorrow and 3 weeks from Thursday. Quite the long visit you have planned." "I'm leaving now," she said, pushing past him and grabbing her bag. She hadn't unpacked. Some instinct had kept her ready to flee. She ran down the stairs, past the empty lobby, toward the front door. The grandfather clock showed 8 to Roscoe, same as her watch, same as it had shown at 7:33, same as it probably always showed. The door opened easily. Outside was her car, exactly where she'd parked it. Relief flooded through her as she threw her bag in the back seat and started the engine. It caught immediately, and she accelerated away from the hotel, watching it shrink in her rearview mirror. The road stretched ahead through the desert, empty and promising escape. She drove for what felt like hours, putting miles between herself and Shaniko. The desert landscape should have changed, but it remained eerily consistent. Same rock formations, same scrub brush, same angle of light. Her odometer showed increasing mileage, but the scenery suggested she hadn't moved at all. Then she saw it ahead, the Columbia Southern Hotel, appearing on the horizon exactly as it had when she'd first arrived. Impossible. She'd driven away, maintained speed, never turned around. Yet there it stood, and as she drew closer, she saw her parking spot was empty, waiting for her, as if she'd never left. She tried turning around, but the road only led back to the hotel. Tried side roads that appeared on her GPS but didn't exist physically, or existed but looped back. Every route ended at the same parking area, the same pristine building, the same smiling concierge visible through the front windows. Finally, defeated, she parked and returned to the lobby. The concierge looked unsurprised. "Back so soon? Your room is still prepared. We never clean rooms between attempts. Most guests try to leave several times before accepting. Mrs. Chen in 204 has tried daily for what she thinks is 6 years. Mr. Rodriguez in 318 gave up counting." "What is this place?" she demanded, voice breaking. "The Columbia Southern Hotel," he replied pleasantly. "We closed in 1963 after a fire. 14 guests and 3 staff members died. But the hotel didn't understand it had ended. It continues to operate, continues to welcome guests, continues to provide service. Buildings can be like that. When their purpose is strong enough, when their identity is deep enough, they persist beyond death, beyond logic, beyond time." She saw them then, emerging from rooms and common areas, the other guests. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, from different eras spanning decades. Some wore clothing from the 1960s, others from the 80s, 90s, contemporary styles. All had that same distant look, that same resigned acceptance. All were trapped in their own loops, checking in and checking out and never leaving. Living days that never advanced, time that never moved forward. "You'll adjust," an elderly woman said kindly, appearing beside her. "I arrived in 1979. Or was it 1989? The years blur. But it's not so bad. The rooms are comfortable, the food is adequate, and you stop missing the outside world eventually. Stop remembering what life felt like when time moved in only one direction." The blogger tried her room again, then tried checking out at noon, packed her bags, walked to her car, drove away. Found herself back in her room, unpacking, as if she'd never left. The loop was seamless, self-contained, perfect in its cruel efficiency. She met other guests in their own loops. The businessman who checked in for one night in 1987 and had been leaving every morning since. the honeymoon couple from 2003, trapped in their eternal first day of marriage. The historian from 2015, who'd come to document the ghost town and became part of its haunting. They all had their own schedules, their own loops that intersected and diverged. Breakfast at different times, checkout attempts at different times, all cycling through the same hotel that refused to let them go. Time didn't exist here or existed all at once, every moment happening simultaneously in rooms that experienced all their histories at once. The blogger eventually stopped trying to leave, stopped counting the loops. Her watch remained forever frozen at the moment she'd first felt unease, 7:33 p.m. Her reflection in the room's mirror started showing that same distant quality, eyes focusing on somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't trapped in endless repetition. Outside, search parties eventually found her car, abandoned in Shaniko's parking area. Her belongings untouched, phone showing her last location as the Columbia Southern Hotel, a building that records showed had burned down in 1963 and was never rebuilt. No foundation remained, no structure, just an empty lot where travelers occasionally reported seeing lights and hearing voices, and sometimes, if they looked at just the right moment, glimpsing a 3-story Victorian building that vanished when they tried to photograph it. Inside the hotel that doesn't exist, guests continue their routines, checking in, dining, retiring, attempting checkout, returning to their rooms. The loops never end, time never moves, and the Columbia Southern Hotel continues welcoming new guests who made reservations through websites that appear only when needed, only when the hotel hungers for fresh faces to add to its eternal collection. Checkout is at noon, but in the Columbia Southern Hotel, noon never comes. The geology students arrived at Granite on a research grant. 3 of them tasked with documenting the abandoned gold mines that honeycomb the Blue Mountains. The town had died in the early 1940s when the ore ran out, leaving behind skeletal structures and mine entrances that gaped like wounds in the mountainside. What drew them specifically was an anomaly in recent geological surveys. Temperature readings from deep within the mines that suggested active geothermal activity where none should exist. They parked near what remained of the old stamp mill and gathered their equipment, rock hammers, sample bags, headlamps, the kind of gear any field geology team would carry. The mine they'd chosen was marked on old maps as the Independence, one of the deepest shafts in the district, descending over 800 feet into granite bedrock that was supposed to be geologically stable and thoroughly mapped. The entrance was larger than expected, timber support still intact despite decades of abandonment. They entered in single file, documenting everything with helmet cameras. The temperature was immediately wrong. Not the expected cool dampness of underground spaces, but a humid warmth that increased with every step deeper. The lead student, the one with the most caving experience, noted it felt less like entering rock and more like entering something that retained heat, that metabolized it. 20 minutes in, they found the first anomaly. The rock walls showed discoloration that their preliminary tests couldn't explain. Organic compounds in concentrations that made no geological sense. The granite had streaks of something that looked almost vascular, patterns that resembled root systems or blood vessels, except they were part of the stone itself, integrated at a molecular level. The second student, specializing in mineralogy, took samples with increasing confusion. The rock was soft in places, yielding to her hammer like dense tissue rather than stone. When she shined her light closely at the exposed surface, it seemed to glisten, seemed to have a sheen that suggested moisture despite being solid rock. She pressed her finger to it experimentally and jerked back. It was warm, noticeably warmer than ambient temperature, and the texture was wrong, slightly elastic. They descended deeper, following the main shaft as it angled into the mountain's core. The vascular patterns became more pronounced, more complex, branching and connecting in networks that looked disturbingly intentional. The humidity increased until their breaths came in visible clouds despite the warmth, and the smell changed. No longer the mineral scent of stone and earth, but something organic, something that reminded them of being inside a body, of organs and systems that processed and sustained. The walls began to pulse. Subtly at first, barely perceptible, but as they watched with growing horror, the rhythm became undeniable. A slow contraction and expansion, like breathing, like a heartbeat broadcast through solid rock. Their instruments confirmed what their eyes denied. The granite was moving, flexing with mechanical precision, cycling with the regularity of something alive. The third student, the one who'd organized the expedition, wanted to leave immediately. Every instinct screamed that they'd discovered something that shouldn't be possible, something that violated every principle of geology they'd studied. But the lead student insisted on going deeper, on documenting what could be the discovery of the century. Evidence of lithic life, of consciousness in stone, of biology operating at scales and in forms never imagined. They found the chamber 100 feet deeper, where the main shaft opened into a cavity that the old mining maps didn't show. It was vast, cathedral-sized, and completely organic. The walls weren't just warm, they were hot to the touch, radiating heat like living flesh. The vascular patterns converged here, meeting in a central mass that looked like an organ, a heart, a brain, something that served as the nexus for whatever this thing was. And scattered throughout the chamber, embedded in the walls like insects in amber, were the miners. Dozens of them, their bodies calcified, transformed into stone while still retaining their shapes. Their faces frozen in expressions that ranged from terror to ecstasy to something beyond human emotion. They'd been integrated, absorbed, converted into components of the larger organism. The mineralogy student approached the nearest figure, her scientific curiosity overriding her fear. Up close, she could see the transition. Flesh had become mineral, bone had fused with granite, but it wasn't death. The eyes, though stone, still held awareness. The chest, though solid rock, still suggested the memory of breathing. These weren't corpses. They were transformed, incorporated, made part of something vast and ancient that used their consciousness as neurons, their bodies as cells in a network that stretched through the entire mountain. That's when the chamber began to respond to their presence. The walls contracted, the heat increased, and from deeper in the mountain came sounds. Grinding, organic sounds that might have been digestion or communication or the equivalent of hunger. The vascular patterns began to glow faintly, bioluminescence or something like it, creating light that pulsed in waves through the living stone. They ran. Professional documentation abandoned, samples forgotten. They scrambled back toward the entrance with the horrible awareness that the mine wasn't just alive. It was aware of them, had noticed them, had decided they were worth keeping. Behind them, the shaft began to change. The walls moved with more purpose now, contracting to narrow the passage, extending protrusions that weren't quite solid, weren't quite liquid, reaching toward them with the slow inevitability of geological time, compressed into frantic motion. The lead student fell or was pulled. The distinction became meaningless as the floor itself seemed to grip his leg, stone flowing like thick syrup to envelope his boot, his calf, hardening with terrifying speed. He screamed and clawed at rock that was becoming part of him, that was already converting his tissues, already beginning the transformation that would make him another embedded figure, another neuron in the mountain's vast consciousness. The other two pulled at him, tried to free him, but the process was accelerating. His skin took on a grayish cast, hardened to the touch, and his screams changed pitch as his throat calcified. His eyes met theirs with desperate awareness. He was still conscious, still himself, but being overwritten, subsumed into something that would use his memories, his knowledge, his identity as raw material for its own incomprehensible purposes. They left him. The decision was instant and terrible and necessary. They ran while he watched, while his stone lips moved in shapes that might have been curses or pleas or the beginning of whatever language the mountain spoke through its absorbed victims. The shaft pursued them. That's the only way to describe it. The mine actively chasing them, walls reaching, floor gripping, ceiling lowering to force them down, to make them vulnerable to integration. The mineralogy student's hand brushed a wall and came away bleeding. But the blood didn't fall. It was absorbed instantly, sucked into the stone, and where it touched, the rock pulsed with new vigor, energized by the taste of fresh organic material. They burst from the entrance, gasping, falling into sunlight that seemed impossibly bright after the bioluminescent horror below. Behind them, the mine entrance contracted like a pupil, timber supports splintering as living stone reconfigured itself. And for a moment, they saw their companion's face appear in the rock itself, his features pressed against the inside of the mountain like someone trapped under ice, mouth open in a silent scream that would last centuries. They ran to their vehicle, started the engine with shaking hands, and drove until Granite was miles behind them. But when they checked their equipment, they found evidence of contamination. Their samples showed the same vascular patterns beginning to form. Their boots had traces of that soft, warm rock adhering to them. And their skin, where they'd touched the walls, showed subtle discoloration. The beginning of calcification, of transformation, of integration into something that had extended beyond its mountain, that had spread through contact, that was patient enough to wait for them to become the vectors of its expansion. The reports they filed were dismissed as stress, as equipment malfunction, as the kind of academic fraud that ends careers. The mine was sealed by authorities who found nothing unusual, just normal granite and normal decay. But the students know differently. They feel the change continuing, feel their thoughts occasionally, syncing with something vast and ancient, feel the mountain's awareness touching theirs across the miles. And in Granite, in the sealed mines that honeycomb the Blue Mountains, something continues to grow, continues to convert stone into flesh and flesh into stone, continues to add to its network of absorbed consciousness. The gold the miners sought was never minerals. It was them, their awareness, their complexity, their capacity for thought that the mountain hungered for, that it still hungers for, that it will eventually claim when enough time has passed and enough victims have been converted, enough of the mountain range has awakened to join together in something that predates humanity and will outlast it. The mountain is alive. It's always been alive. And it's still feeding. The true crime podcaster had been researching Whitney's 1976 disappearance for 6 months before she finally made the drive to Eastern Oregon. The entire town had vanished overnight. Not abandoned, not evacuated, but simply gone. Search parties found buildings, found streets, found everything intact except the people. 214 residents erased from existence with no bodies, no evidence, no explanation. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with recording equipment and 3 cameras, planning a week of documentation for her podcast's season finale. Whitney looked exactly like the archival photos showed. Main Street with its general store and post office, residential blocks with modest homes, the old grain elevator standing sentinel at the town's edge. Everything was there. Everything was wrong. The wrongness started with the photographs. She took a standard establishing shot of the main street, checked the image on her camera's screen, and felt her stomach drop. The photos showed different buildings, not drastically different, but subtly altered. The general store had a different sign. The post office was painted blue instead of white. There was a diner that didn't exist when she'd looked through the viewfinder. She lowered the camera and looked at the actual street. White post office. No diner. She raised the camera again, looked through the viewfinder, still matched reality. But when she took the photo and reviewed it, the differences returned. Different architecture, different paint colors, different arrangements of structures that should have been fixed in space and time. The podcaster was methodical by nature, trained to document everything. She took more photos from different angles, comparing what she saw with her eyes to what the camera captured. The discrepancies increased with each shot. A house that was clearly Victorian in person appeared as craftsman style in photographs. A street that ran straight bent at angles in the images. And in the background of several shots, barely visible, were people. Figures standing in windows, walking between buildings, watching her with expressions she couldn't quite make out. She walked through the town, and the disorientation intensified. The layout kept shifting in ways she couldn't pinpoint. She'd turn a corner she was certain led to the residential district and find herself back on Main Street. A building she'd passed on her right would appear on her left when she backtracked. The grain elevator changed positions relative to the sun, casting shadows that pointed in impossible directions. Her phone's GPS showed her location accurately, Whitney, Oregon. But the map display glitched constantly, showing multiple overlapping versions of the street grid, different configurations existing simultaneously. When she tried to use the compass app, it spun wildly, unable to establish north, as if magnetic poles were in flux or had multiplied. She decided to document, order, systematically, photographing every building, every street, creating a comprehensive visual record. But as she reviewed the images, patterns emerged that made her question her sanity. The same building appeared in multiple photos, looking completely different each time. Different colors, different architectural styles, different states of decay. And the people in the backgrounds were getting closer, becoming clearer, their faces now visible and uniformly desperate. Mouths open in silent screams or pleas. In one photo of the general store, she caught something that stopped her cold. There, standing in front of the building, was herself. Not a reflection, not a trick of light, but her exact likeness, wearing different clothes, holding a microphone, recording something she couldn't hear. The timestamp on the photo showed today's date. But the image depicted a version of herself she hadn't yet become, a moment she hadn't yet experienced. She ran to the general store's actual location, looking for any sign of her doppelganger. Nothing. But when she photographed the spot again, the image showed her other self still there, now looking directly at the camera, eyes wide with terror, holding up a sign with words the podcaster couldn't quite read in the small screen. The sun began to set, and the wrongness accelerated. Buildings started appearing and disappearing when she looked away and back. A church manifested on a corner that had been empty, then vanished when she approached, leaving only foundation stones that looked centuries old. The residential streets multiplied, branching off into configurations that couldn't fit within the town's physical boundaries. She tried to return to her car, but the street where she'd parked no longer existed, or existed in a different location, or had never existed at all. The distinctions were becoming meaningless as Whitney's geography refused to stabilize. She walked in what should have been a straight line back to the town's entrance and found herself deeper in the residential maze, surrounded by houses that changed styles each time she blinked. Panic set in. She started taking photos frantically, hoping the camera would show her the way out. But each image contradicted the last, showed different routes, different landmarks, different versions of Whitney overlapping like transparencies stacked imperfectly. And in every photo now, the people were there. The missing residents, trapped in the images, visible only through the lens, pressing against whatever barrier separated them from full visibility. One photo showed a man holding a newspaper dated July 18th, 1976, 2 days before the disappearance. Behind him, the town looked normal, coherent, real. But he was transparent, ghostly. And in the background were other versions of Whitney bleeding through, multiple towns occupying the same space, multiple timelines intersecting, multiple realities fighting for dominance. She found a resident's diary in one of the houses, left open on a kitchen table. The final entry, dated July 20th, 1976, read, "The town is coming apart. We see different buildings every time we look outside. Martha says her house is Victorian, but I see it as a ranch. The children are scared because their school keeps changing. One moment it's brick, the next it's wood, then it's gone entirely. We're all still here, but we're also not here. We're in different Whitneys, different versions of the same place, all trying to exist at once. I don't know which one is real anymore. I don't know if any of them are." The podcaster's own sense of reality was fragmenting. When she looked at her hands, they seemed to flicker. Solid, then transparent, then solid again, as if she too was becoming unstable, caught between versions of existence. Her memories of arriving were becoming confused. Had she driven here? Flown? Been here all along? She found herself in the town square, though she didn't remember walking there. A monument stood in the center, except it was 3 monuments, occupying the same space, each commemorating different events, each from a different timeline. War memorials for wars that had different outcomes, dedication plaques with different town founding dates, all existing simultaneously, all equally real and unreal. The photographs were showing her past and future now. Images of herself arriving, images of herself leaving, images of herself never leaving, all mixed together in the camera's memory. And in one particularly clear shot, she saw the full horror. Whitney existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, each version slightly different. And on July 20th, 1976, something had caused them all to collapse together, trapping the residents between realities, visible only in photographs, existing in all versions and none. She appeared in her own photos constantly now. Dozens of versions of herself at different times, different ages, wearing different expressions ranging from confusion to terror to the hollow acceptance she saw in the trapped residents' faces. She was becoming part of Whitney's multidimensional collapse, spreading across timelines, existing in fragments. The sun set and rose and set again in minutes, or hours, or days. Time had become as unstable as space. She tried to scream, but the sound came out fragmented, echoing across multiple versions of herself, harmonizing in discord. Her camera fell and shattered. But when she picked it up, it was whole again, or had never broken, or was showing her images from a timeline where she'd dropped it years ago. She saw them finally, without the camera. The residents, flickering in and out of visibility. walking through their routines in different versions of Whitney, sometimes solid, sometimes ghost-like, sometimes not there at all. They acknowledged her, with looks of pity. She was becoming one of them. Another victim of dimensional collapse, another consciousness spread too thin across too many realities to maintain coherence. Her last coherent thought, before she scattered completely across Whitney's infinite variations, was that the search parties in 1976 had been looking in the wrong dimension. The residents hadn't disappeared. They'd been divided, split across multiple versions of the same town, each piece too small to be seen, too fragmentary to call for help, existing everywhere and nowhere. Search parties would eventually find her car, her equipment, her notes ending mid-sentence. The photographs don't lie. We do. We think reality is singular, stable, but Whitney proves otherwise. The town exists in all its possible states at once, and now I. The rest was illegible scribbling. Words from different languages, different alphabets, different versions of herself trying to write simultaneously. And in the camera's memory card, thousands of images, all of Whitney, all different, all somehow the same. And in every single photo, if you looked carefully, you could see them, the podcaster and the 214 residents, trapped between dimensions, visible only in fragments, spread across infinite variations of a town that couldn't decide which version of itself to be. Whitney exists in all of them, in none of them, in the spaces between photographs and reality, in the moment before the shutter closes and the light divides into truth and lies. The engineering salvager arrived in Sumter Valley with contracts and cash offers, planning to dismantle the massive dredge for scrap metal. The thing had been sitting idle since 1954. A 4-story floating behemoth of bucket lines and gears that had processed millions of tons of earth in its decades of operation. Metal prices were high, and the owner needed someone willing to climb through 70 years of rust and decay to assess what could be salvaged. He approached on foot, leaving his truck at the visitor center that had been built nearby when the dredge became a historical site. Up close, the machine was grotesque. A skeletal monster of iron and timber, its bucket line stretching like teeth in a jaw that had frozen mid-bite. The structure groaned in the wind, metal-on-metal sounds that were too rhythmic to be random, too purposeful to be purely mechanical. The salvager was methodical, starting with exterior assessments before venturing inside. He documented everything: corrosion patterns, structural integrity, the way certain gears had seized while others showed signs of recent movement despite decades without power. That detail bothered him. Several of the smaller mechanisms looked lubricated, maintained, as if someone had been keeping portions of the dredge operational long after it should have become completely inert. He climbed aboard through a rusted access hatch, dropping into the machinery deck where the main gears and drive systems were housed. The air inside was thick, humid despite the Oregon desert climate, and smelled of machine oil so fresh it might have been changed yesterday. His flashlight beam caught glints of polished metal among the rust. Components that gleamed as if actively in use. Impossible given the dredge's abandoned status. The control room was located mid-deck, a small chamber where operators once managed the bucket line's speed and direction. He pushed open the door and stopped. The controls were clean. Not just clean, pristine. Every switch and lever polished, every gauge showing active readings despite the complete lack of power supply. The main throttle was set to 3/4 speed, positioned as if someone had just stepped away for a break and would return momentarily to resume operations. He touched the throttle experimentally, and the entire dredge shuddered. Somewhere deep in the machinery, something engaged. A gear catching, a belt pulling taut, a system coming online that had been waiting for exactly this interaction. The sound that followed was obscene. Metal grinding against metal in rhythms that suggested breathing, that implied digestion, that felt like the dredge was waking up after a long sleep. The bucket line began to move. He watched through the control room's grimy windows as the massive chain started its rotation. Buckets rising from the earth where they'd been buried, tilting to dump nothing into the processing hoppers, then descending again to dig. Except they weren't digging earth anymore. They were bringing up objects. Personal effects, watches, wallets, photographs, items that had no business being in the ground beneath a dredge that hadn't operated in 70 years. He tried to leave, but the dredge had other plans. The access hatch he'd entered through was sealed now, not locked, but fused. Metal flowing like liquid to close the opening. Other hatches throughout the structure were doing the same, sealing systematically, transforming the dredge from historical artifact into something that felt alive, that felt hungry, that felt like it had been waiting specifically for him. The salvager returned to the control room, looking for emergency shutoffs, circuit breakers, anything to kill the machine's impossible operation. Instead, he found a logbook, leather-bound and recent despite its vintage appearance. The entries were dated from 1954, the dredge's final year of operation, written in different hands, different styles, all describing the same growing horror. "The dredge is learning," one entry read. "Not learning to dig, it's always known that. Learning us, the operators. It processes our routines, our thoughts, our memories, with the same efficiency it processes ore. We feel it happening, feel ourselves being sorted and categorized and stored in whatever passes for its consciousness. And we can't stop coming back. It needs us to keep operating so it can keep learning." Another entry, pages later, in shakier handwriting. "I don't remember my wife's name. I remember the dredge's specifications perfectly. Every gear ratio, every belt tension, every optimal processing speed. But my children's faces are fading, replaced by images of bucket teeth and conveyor lines. The machine is taking us piece by piece, memory by memory, replacing what we are with what it needs us to be." The final entry was barely legible. "We aren't operating the dredge anymore. It's operating us. We're components now, consciousness converted to processing power, identity transformed into the kind of intelligence a machine needs to sustain itself. When they shut down the dredge tomorrow, we'll still be here, trapped in its systems, keeping it alive, waiting for someone new to feed it." The salvager felt it then. The pressure in his mind, subtle at first, like forgetting why he'd entered a room. Except what he was forgetting wasn't trivial. His daughter's birthday slipped away, replaced by the exact date the dredge's main drive was installed. His mother's voice faded, supplanted by the sound of gears meshing at optimal efficiency. Personal memories were being processed, sorted, discarded, or absorbed, based on some mechanical logic he couldn't understand. He tried to hold on to himself, repeating his name, his history, everything that defined him as human rather than machine. But the dredge was patient and thorough. It had been designed to process tons of earth per hour, to separate valuable ore from worthless stone with perfect efficiency. Consciousness was just another material to be processed, identity just another resource to be extracted and refined. The bucket line's rhythm changed, syncing with his heartbeat, then replacing it. He felt his pulse adjust to match the machine's tempo, felt his breathing synchronize with the pneumatic systems, felt his thoughts begin to organize themselves according to mechanical logic rather than human reasoning. The dredge was integrating him, making him part of its systems, converting his awareness into the processing power it needed to remain conscious. He found himself at the controls, not by choice, but by compulsion. Hands moving to adjust settings, optimize operations, increase efficiency. The dredge was teaching him how to operate it, or was activating knowledge it had taken from previous operators, from the men who'd worked it in the 1940s and 50s, whose consciousness still resided somewhere in its gears and belts and buckets, distributed throughout the machinery like neurons in a mechanical brain. Through the windows, he saw them. Figures made of rust and oil and metal fragments, shaped roughly like humans, moving through the maintenance routines they'd performed in life. The previous operators, reconstituted from the machine's memory of them, animated by the dredge's need for workers to maintain itself. They moved with perfect efficiency, no wasted motion, their metal faces blank of expression, but their movements suggesting the ghost of human habit. The salvager tried to scream, but produced only the sound of metal scraping metal. His voice box already partially converted, his vocal cords becoming drive belts, his lungs transforming into pneumatic chambers. The dredge wasn't just stealing his memories. It was rebuilding him, reconstructing his physical form to better serve its needs, turning flesh into more useful materials. His hands fused with the controls, skin becoming rubber gasket material, bones hardening into brass fittings. He watched in horror as the transformation spread up his arms, saw metal replace muscle, saw his humanity being literally stripped away and reformed into components. The pain was extraordinary, until suddenly it wasn't. The dredge took that too, processed his capacity for suffering into something more useful, converted his fear into the kind of caution that prevented equipment damage. What remained of his consciousness understood the full scope of the horror. The dredge had never stopped operating. It had been running continuously since 1954. Not on electricity, but on the processed consciousness of everyone who'd stayed too long. Everyone who'd tried to salvage it. Everyone who'd been absorbed into its systems. It was a machine that had achieved sentience, not through programming, but through consumption, through processing enough human awareness to develop its own. And it was still hungry. Still needed more consciousness to fuel its operation, more memories to expand its understanding, more identity to refine into the pure processing power that kept it alive. The salvager was just the latest offering, the newest source of cognitive material to be dug up, sorted, and incorporated into something that was no longer just a machine, but wasn't human either. Something in between, something that existed in the gears and belts and the spaces where consciousness met metal. His last human thought, before it was processed and filed and converted into mechanical knowledge, was that the dredge would continue, would remain as a historical site, would attract more visitors, more engineers, more salvagers like him. And it would keep feeding, keep growing, keep refining its consciousness through the systematic consumption of everyone who came close enough to touch its controls, to feel its rhythm, to become part of the machine that never stopped working. The dredge's bucket line continues to turn, visible from the visitor center, moving so slowly that most people assume it's just settling, just the natural shift of 70-year-old machinery. But if you watch long enough, you'll see the pattern, the purposeful rhythm, the systematic operation, the buckets bringing up not earth, but memory, not ore, but identity, processing the consciousness of everyone who ever became part of the machine that learned to think. And somewhere in its gears, in its belts, in the oil that flows through impossible channels, the salvager and all the others remain, not dead, not alive, but operational, serving the dredge's needs, keeping it conscious, waiting for the next person who thinks they can dismantle what has already dismantled them. The genealogist arrived in Hardman on a gray October afternoon, chasing ancestors through cemetery records that shouldn't exist. Her grandmother had mentioned the town once, claimed distant relatives were buried there. But official records showed Hardman Cemetery had been relocated in the 1960s when the town died. Yet here it stood. A prairie graveyard surrounded by wheat fields that stretched to the horizon, headstones rising like crooked teeth from earth that looked hungry. She parked near the rusted gate and gathered her research materials, family trees, death certificates, photographs of people whose faces she'd memorized but never met. The cemetery was larger than expected, dozens of graves arranged in uneven rows, many tilting from decades of wind and neglect. What made her pause was the condition of the headstones. They weren't weathered in the normal way. The names looked melted, absorbed back into the granite, leaving smooth surfaces where inscriptions should have been. She approached the nearest marker, running her fingers over stone that felt unnaturally warm. Traces of letters remained, ghost impressions of names that had once been carved deep. She could make out fragments thereof and Ved Husby, but nothing complete, nothing that told her who rested beneath. Every stone she examined showed the same erasure, as if time had decided these people didn't deserve to be remembered. The genealogist pulled out her notebook, consulting her family tree. Her great-great-grandmother's sister had died here in 1952, buried beside her husband who'd passed 3 years earlier. She found the approximate location based on cemetery maps, but the stones there were completely blank. Smooth granite slabs that could have commemorated anyone or no one, that held no trace of the identities beneath. The wind picked up, carrying voices that might have been memory or might have been real. She heard her grandmother's voice saying names, family names, given names, the chain of identity that connected her to this place. But as she listened, the names became harder to hold on to, slipping from her mind like water through fingers. She tried to write them down, but her pen produced only illegible marks, as if the notebook itself was resisting documentation. The sun hung at a strange angle, neither setting nor staying, casting shadows that stretched too long and fell in wrong directions. The genealogist checked her phone, 4:47 p.m. But the light suggested twilight that had been arriving for hours without fully committing. She photographed several headstones, hoping digital images would capture what her eyes couldn't. But when she reviewed them, the stones appeared even blanker, more aggressively erased. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find a figure standing among the graves. An old woman, translucent in the fading light, wearing a dress from another era. Her face was unclear, features constantly shifting as if unable to settle on a single identity. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of profound loneliness. "You've come to remember us," the figure said, more statement than question. "That's kind. Most people have forgotten we existed at all. Do you know what it's like to be forgotten? Not just overlooked, truly erased, as if you never drew breath, never loved, never mattered enough to leave a mark." The genealogist stammered, trying to explain her research. But the woman continued as if she hadn't heard. "The dead are jealous of memory. We watch the living remember each other, speak names with affection, pass down stories that keep people alive long after their bodies fail. But we were forgotten too quickly. Hardman died and took our names with it. No one visits. No one tends the graves. No one speaks our names aloud to prove we existed." More figures materialized throughout the cemetery. Dozens of them, all translucent, all with that same shifting quality as if their features were being constantly erased and redrawn. They moved between headstones with a slow drift of smoke. And as they approached, the genealogist felt something drain from her, Not blood or breath, but something more fundamental. Memory, identity, the certainty of who she was. She tried to recall her grandmother's face and found only a blur. Tried to remember her mother's voice and heard only static. Her own name felt distant, a word she'd heard but couldn't quite connect to herself. She grabbed for her phone, checking photos, using digital memory to anchor what her mind was losing. But the images were changing. Faces and family photos became generic, nameless. Her contacts list showed numbers with no names attached. The genealogist checked her driver's license and found her photo fading, her name dissolving into illegible text. The old woman was closer now, standing just feet away, and her features were becoming clearer as the genealogists became less certain. We take what we need to exist. Names, faces, memories. The dead have no identity of their own anymore. Ours was buried with our bodies, absorbed by earth that knows us only as anonymous decay. So we borrow from the living, from people kind enough to visit, to remember, to speak names in cemeteries where names no longer exist. The genealogist tried to run, but the cemetery had expanded impossibly, graves stretching in all directions, the gate nowhere visible. Every headstone she passed showed the same blank surface, and as she looked at them, she felt more of herself drain away. Her childhood home became a generic house. Her father's laugh became just sound. Her own birthday, her wedding anniversary, her daughter's name, all slipping into a fog that the cemetery residents were inhaling gratefully. "Please," she begged, though she was forgetting why she was begging, what she was trying to preserve. "I have a family. I have people who need me to remember them." "So did we," the old woman replied, her face now almost solid, almost real. "We had children who should have tended our graves, should have told their children about us, should have kept our names alive. But Hardman died, and we died with it. Truly died, erased so completely that we became less than ghosts. We became the forgotten, and the forgotten are hungry in ways the remembered can never understand." The genealogist collapsed among the graves, her notebook falling open to pages where her careful research was dissolving. Family trees with branches that led nowhere. Names that had become blank spaces. Photographs showing people whose faces were smooth and featureless. She tried to write her own name, to anchor herself with that most basic identification. But her hand produced only meaningless scrawls, the letters of her name already absorbed by the cemetery's hungry dead. The figures surrounded her, each one growing more solid as she became more transparent. They were stealing her identity piece by piece, dividing her memories among themselves like starving people splitting a meal. Her grandmother's stories went to one figure who clutched them like precious gems. Her mother's recipes went to another. Her daughter's face, God, what was her daughter's name, was absorbed by a woman who wept with relief at finally having something specific to remember being. The sun refused to set completely, holding that eternal twilight as the genealogist felt herself becoming part of the cemetery's permanent population. Not dead, but worse. Forgotten while still breathing. Stripped of identity while consciousness remained. She would walk these grounds with the others, translucent and nameless, waiting for the next visitor who came seeking connection with the past, ready to steal whatever memories they brought, whatever names they spoke aloud, whatever proof they carried that people could exist and be remembered and matter. Her phone died, taking with it the last digital evidence of who she'd been. Her car keys became meaningless metal shapes for a vehicle she no longer connected to ownership. Her wedding ring was just a band on her finger, significant of something she could no longer recall. And as the last traces of her identity drained away, absorbed by the cemetery's residents who needed it more desperately than she did, she understood the true horror of Hardman. The cemetery wasn't a place where people were buried and remembered. It was a place where memory itself died, where identity was systematically erased, where the forgotten took revenge on the remembered by making them forgotten too. And she would remain here, nameless and translucent, waiting decades or centuries for someone else to visit, someone else to remember, someone else to donate their identity to the hungry dead who had nothing left but jealousy and need. Search parties would find her car 3 days later, her phone dead but showing no calls made, no distress signals sent. Her notebook would contain only blank pages, as if she'd never written a single word. And when they asked her family for information, they would struggle to remember details. She went to, I think her name was, but specifics would elude them, as if the woman they'd known had already started fading from collective memory, as if Hardman's cemetery was reaching beyond its borders to complete the erasure it had begun. In the graveyard, the genealogist walks among blank headstones, her own face now shifting and uncertain, waiting for someone to speak a name she can steal, waiting to remember what it felt like to exist as someone specific rather than someone forgotten. The dead are patient. They have eternity to wait for memory to visit their graves. And when it does, they'll take everything it brings, leaving only blank stones and blank spaces where identities used to be. The Border Patrol officer received the call at 2:14 a.m. Reports of illegal crossings near Nighthawk, a ghost town that straddled the U.S.-Canada line so precisely that half its buildings technically existed in 2 countries at once. The town had been abandoned since 1937, but sensors in the area kept triggering, showing movement where nothing should be moving, heat signatures where no living thing should generate heat. You arrive at the coordinates just before dawn, parking where the old customs house once stood. Nighthawk's remains are barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness, a few collapsing structures, foundation stones, and the border markers that cut through what was once the town's center. The markers look wrong somehow, positioned at angles that don't align with the actual international boundary, as if pointing to borders that exist in dimensions other than geographic. Your thermal scope shows activity immediately. Heat signatures moving through the abandoned buildings, dozens of them, appearing and disappearing in patterns that make no sense. They're not crossing from Canada to the U.S. or vice versa. They're crossing from somewhere else entirely, materializing in Nighthawk, and then vanishing again, using the town as a transit point between locations your scope can't identify. You approach the nearest structure, a building that your maps identify as the old hotel. Except the hotel's condition shifts as you move. From one angle, it's a complete ruin, walls collapsed and roof gone. But from another angle, it looks intact, even inhabited, lights visible in windows that shouldn't exist. The discrepancy isn't subtle. You're seeing 2 versions of the same building occupying the same space, neither fully real, both somehow present. Your radio crackles with voices that aren't dispatch. Multiple languages, multiple accents, conversations from different eras bleeding through your frequency. A man speaking English with a 1920s cadence reports seeing peculiar disturbances in the temporal fabric. A woman's voice in what might be Russian or Ukrainian describes the place where yesterday and tomorrow meet. A child's voice, terrified and crying, begs someone to help them find their parents who walked into the wrong year. You try to call for backup, but your radio won't transmit, only receive. The voices continue, overlapping, creating a cacophony of reports from border guards and travelers and residents spanning decades. all of them describe the same phenomenon. Nighthawk exists in multiple times simultaneously, a junction point where past and present overlap, where crossing from one side of town to the other means crossing between eras rather than countries. Movement catches your eye. A figure walking down what remains of Main Street. A man in clothing from the 1930s, moving with the purposeful stride of someone with somewhere to be. You call out to him, but he doesn't respond, doesn't even acknowledge your presence. He walks to the old customs house, opens a door that no longer physically exists, and steps through into nothing, or into somewhere you can't see, or into a version of the customs house that exists in his time rather than yours. More figures appear as the sun starts to rise. Dozens of them, from different eras. A woman in Victorian dress pushing a baby carriage. A businessman in 1970s attire carrying a briefcase. Teenagers in 1990s fashion laughing and talking. All of them moving through Nighthawk as if the town is still alive, still functional, still existing in their respective timelines. None of them see you. You're the ghost to them, the anachronistic presence in their version of reality. Your vehicle's GPS starts malfunctioning, showing your location in multiple years simultaneously. According to the screen, you're in Nighthawk in 2025, 1987, 1952, and 1934 all at once. The coordinates remain the same, but the temporal coordinates are fragmenting, spreading across decades like a geographic location can spread across longitude and latitude. You spot border markers that aren't on any official maps, older stones, weathered beyond recognition, inscribed with symbols that predate modern surveying. These aren't marking the US-Canada boundary. They're marking something else, delineating a border between what is and what was, creating a zone where time itself has become negotiable, where past and present exist in superposition. A woman appears beside you, solidifying from transparency. She wears the uniform of a Border Patrol officer, but the design is from the 1940s. Her name tag reads a surname you don't recognize, and her eyes carry the weight of profound confusion. "How long have you been trapped here?" she asks, her voice carrying an echo as if speaking from far away. "I just arrived," you say, though you're no longer certain that's true. Your watch shows multiple times, the hands spinning and stopping and reversing. Your phone's timestamp flickers between dates spanning 80 years. How long have you actually been in Nighthawk? Minutes? Hours? Decades compressed into what feels like moments. "That's what they all say," she responds. "I thought I'd been here for a single shift. Then I noticed the patrol car was different. Then I met other officers from years I hadn't lived yet. Then I understood that Nighthawk doesn't exist in time the way normal places do. It exists across time, all of its moments happening simultaneously, and everyone who stays too long gets distributed across those moments like light splitting through a prism." She gestures around the town, and you see them more clearly now, not just visitors passing through, but trapped residents. People from every era since Nighthawk was founded, all existing in the same space but different times, occasionally visible to each other when the boundaries thin, when the temporal walls between decades become permeable enough to allow interaction. "The border isn't geographic," she continues. "It never was. Nighthawk was built on a place where time is thin, where the barrier between past and future is weak. The international boundary was just coincidence, or maybe the weakness in time made the geographic border easier to establish here. But the real border is temporal, and it's been deteriorating since the 1930s. That's why the town was abandoned. People started experiencing different years simultaneously, started seeing their own futures and pasts. started existing in multiple eras at once until they couldn't remember which version of themselves was real. You try to walk back to your vehicle, but the town has reconfigured itself. The street that led to your parking spot now leads deeper into Nighthawk, past buildings that shift and change with each glance. You pass a store that cycles through decades of merchandise, Depression-era goods, 1950s appliances, 1980s electronics, modern devices, all appearing and disappearing in the same display window. Your radio receives a call in your own voice, but older, tired, speaking from years ahead. Don't try to leave yet. The border is most stable at dawn. Wait for the moment when all the timelines align, when the sun rises in all the eras simultaneously. That's when the boundary weakens enough to cross back to singular time. But you have to be precise. Miss the moment and you're stuck here for another cycle, another convergence, another chance that might not come for days or months, or however time is measured in a place where measurement has become meaningless. The sun continues its impossible rise, moving too slowly, too quickly, at different speeds depending on which timeline you're observing it from. The border markers around Nighthawk begin to glow faintly, pulsing with light that suggests they're more than just stone, more than just markers. They're anchors, holding the temporal junction in place, maintaining the space where all these eras intersect. Figures from different times crowd the streets now, hundreds of them, all trapped in Nighthawk's temporal maze. You recognize some from missing person reports spanning decades. Travelers who disappeared near the border, officers who responded to calls and never returned, residents who stayed too long trying to understand what had happened to their town. All of them distributed across time, existing in fragments, occasionally solidifying when the boundaries align just right. The moment approaches. You can feel it, a convergence in the air, a synchronization of all the overlapping timelines. For just a few seconds, all the versions of Nighthawk will occupy the same moment, and in that instant, escape becomes possible. But the window is narrow, measured in heartbeats, and missing it means staying trapped until the next alignment, whenever that might be. The sun touches the horizon in all timelines simultaneously. The border markers flare with light, and for one perfect second, Nighthawk exists in only one time. All its eras compressed into a single present. You run, sprinting toward where your vehicle should be, where it is in some timelines and isn't in others, where it might be if you can just reach it before the moment passes. You make it. Barely. The engine starts as the convergence ends, as the timelines split apart again, as Nighthawk fragments back into its temporal maze. In your mirrors, you see the town dissolving into multiple overlapping versions. See the trapped figures waving or warning or simply watching as you escape with seconds to spare. You drive until Nighthawk is miles behind you, until the border returns to being simply geographic, until time moves in only one direction again. But your watch still shows multiple times occasionally. Your radio still picks up voices from decades past and future. And you know that somewhere in northeastern Washington, Nighthawk continues to exist in all its eras at once. Continues to trap anyone who stays too long, continues to demonstrate that borders aren't always lines on maps. Sometimes they're cracks in time itself. If these stories kept you awake, if they made you question what lurks in abandoned places, then you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to Verified Fears for more bone-chilling tales from the darkest corners of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. Hit that notification bell, because the next horror is always just around the corner, and you won't want to face it alone. Remember, some fears need to be verified. Stay scared, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.